So I'm really delighted today to welcome Peter Mauch, who is going to talk to us about his fantastic new book, which I have read in very great detail, um, on Tojo. Yes, the rise and fall of Japan's most controversial World War II general. Peter is located at the University of Western Sydney, which I guess is sort of just up the road from us here, basically, right? And he teaches Asian history, Japanese history. He has authored numerous papers, chapters, articles, including a major monograph on Nomura Chisaburo. And he's currently working on a translation of Emperor Hirohito's so-called monologue, and at the same time, he's a glutton for punishment, working on a biography of Hirohito as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I'll open with a quick word of thanks both to the ANU Japan Institute and to the Modern Japan History Association, and ultimately also to Andrew, who I think has played something of a role in bringing everything together. So thanks both to individuals and institutions, which is perhaps a nice way to open a talk around a biography, which, if this biography achieves anything, perhaps hopefully it's not simply the life of a man, but it seeks to situate him certainly within the institution of the army and how the army, for example, related to other institutions, including, of course, say that of the emperor. I think most of us are quite familiar with Tojo himself. He was, of course, a general of the Japanese army. He was born in 1884 and was executed as a war criminal in 1948. And I'm going to open my observations by noting some of the hesitations with which I embarked on this particular project. And I guess if I put them reasonably simply, my hesitations were effectively threefold. So first, I had trained under Asada Sadao, Japan's great naval historian, and therefore identified very much as a naval historian. And to the outside observer, perhaps the distinction between military and naval history is, maybe it seems like I'm splitting hairs perhaps, and yet in the Japanese context at least, that distinction is a very, very important one. The two armed services did not see eye to eye on practically anything, and that's had a really interesting effect and impact on post-war scholarship. So that, to cite a simple example, the official Senshi Sosho series, which is the series compiled by what today is Japan's Defense Ministry, and using the archival materials in the defense archives, is split. There are 101, 102 volumes, which are split more or less perfectly evenly between the military volumes and the naval volumes, and never the twain do in fact meet. So therein lay my perhaps first hesitation. My second one also stems back to Asada, who back in the late 1980s, I think it was, wrote or edited a terrific book published by Columbia, a guide to Japanese archival sources, as well as Japanese scholarship. And there's a wonderful line in there where he, again, this is late 1980s, he noted the lack of studies of Tojo, and he explained this as owing, at least in part, to what he called Tojo's unappealing personality. So there's my second point of hesitation at the outset of this project. The third was that as I began reading more deeply, I was encountering a lot of works, not academic histories as such, but in fact, these were partisan political tracts which sought to revive and resuscitate Tojo in what we might call, say, Japanese war memory. And frankly, I found them not perhaps the most interesting things to read. And so put those three things together, and to be perfectly honest, as I set out on this project, I did find myself wondering what I had got myself into. Nonetheless, there were, allowing for those hesitations, I also saw that there was good reason to push ahead with the project. The first one, I think, is a reasonably obvious point to make, but not since 1961, when Robert Buteau published his Tojo and the Coming of the War, had a study of this sort been attempted in English. And in those intervening decades, a wealth of papers and archival materials have in fact become available, and of course compel a wide-ranging rethink of Tojo in the period leading up to and ultimately ending in Japanese surrender in World War II. Beyond the sources themselves, there's also the work being done by Japanese historians. So there's a considerable body of work, certainly published since Buteau's work back in '61, where Japanese historians have done a considerable amount of work on, for example, the Japanese Army as an institution. And more recently, there has been something of a minor Tojo boom in Japanese scholarship. And if I bring all of this together, these sources, which had certainly not been available back in '61, they enabled and in fact compelled a wide-ranging rethink of Tojo and the events in which he participated. And so my next, or basically from here, originally when I started writing this talk, in fact, I started almost rewriting the biography in short, thinking, can I knock over the life and times of Tojo in 20 minutes? And that proved impossible, which maybe I should have seen that before I began. Nonetheless, having tried that and decided that that was getting me nowhere fast, I think I got up to roughly 1900 or so by the 20-minute mark and realized that, okay, maybe I need to take a slightly different approach to this talk. So rather than follow him chronologically through his life and times, I thought instead I would pursue an idea that I raise in the introduction. And that idea is that as military biography, I think this book has perhaps 2 points of entry for readers. Some, I think, may regard the book as a biography of the man against the backdrop of Japanese military history. Other readers perhaps might see it as a study of the Japanese army through the conceptual lens afforded by Tojo. And maybe there may be a third way as well. But those were certainly the two that occurred to me. And so with that thought in mind, I think I'll offer some thoughts about what this study in fact is. And the first thought that occurs to me is it's a study of Tojo's understanding of the changing nature of warfare in the 20th century. He was, in one sense, what we might call a conservative or a traditionalist, insofar as his experiences, for example, in the Japanese Army's elite educational apparatus, meant he remained wedded to, for example, the offensive and to minutely detailed operational planning, which it was presumed, would deliver a decisive battle fought soon after the outbreak of hostilities. But he was, in another sense, anything but a traditionalist or a conservative, and he was, in fact, something of a reformer. He spent several years in Central Europe in the immediate aftermath of World War I, studying the causes of German defeat. And he came away from that experience a firm believer in the totality of modern warfare, which had become, in essence, something vastly more than could be accounted for in operational planning. This was, he was reaching an understanding of warfare that, or he understood warfare to be an all-encompassing national project, running the gamut of a nation's political, economic, industrial, scientific, technological, financial, commercial, diplomatic, and even societal endeavors. And so to bring these thoughts together, and it's not terribly easy to bring them together because they're widely or almost directly contradictory, and yet, not unlike very many of his contemporaries, Tojo straddled these two seemingly incompatible positions. So that he was, on the one hand, a reformer, or what historian Michael Barnhart once called a total war officer. But he, in that case, though, he was also, or he presented sometimes as a traditionalist. Or we could put it the other way around, that he was in fact a conservative or a traditionalist who prioritized those minute operational plans and compelling the enemy into some kind of decisive battle soon after the outbreak of hostilities, who nonetheless also presented as a progressive, who understood that warfare had in fact changed. And again, they're almost directly contradictory positions, and yet he seemed, as did very many of his contemporaries in the Japanese army, and I suspect more widely across militaries around the world, he straddled these two seemingly contradictory positions. And perhaps that is a point which may come up in the conversation after I'm done speaking. To move on to another aspect of the book, what perhaps it's a study of, it is a study of the army's outsized role in Japan's colonial experiment in Manchuria, and certainly of Tojo's role therein. He served in the mid-1930s, first as Kwantung Army Provost Marshal, and later as Chief of Staff. And there, he moved well beyond the operational planning that was the hallmark of a Japanese staff officer, and in fact concerned himself very, very directly with all of those things that a total war officer may well consider his forte. So economic, industrial, scientific, technological matters as they impacted Manchuria, and ultimately, of course, the Japanese Empire as a whole. And of course, thinking of Tojo's role in Manchuria in the mid-1930s means that this book is also a study of Japanese continental aggression. And so now I'm dispensing with chronology, but it traces, for example, Tojo's cooperation. Oh, no, let me try again. Sorry. If we take the story back to the Manchurian incident of September 1931, which I think most of us are perhaps aware of the broad contours of the Manchurian incident being what, say, Sadako Ogata once called defiance in Manchuria. So the Kwantung Army acting independent of government policy and acting in defiance of the central military authorities in Tokyo. The book, I think and hope, it offers a slightly more nuanced look at Tokyo's response to Kwantung Army's show of defiance. Certainly, that broad story rings true. That's not to be overthrown, and yet, Tojo, along with a reasonable number of other, say, mid to lower high-ranking general officers in Tokyo acted carefully to ensure that the top brass in Tokyo ultimately capitalized on what the Kwantung Army was doing in Manchuria. And this, maybe I'll just leave that thought there. The book is equally a study, to go back to this idea of the book being a study of Japanese continental aggression, it's a study of Tojo, again, as Kwantung Army Chief of Staff, who in June 1937 took Japan to the brink of war with the Soviet Union, and once again in direct defiance of orders emanating from the military authorities in Tokyo. That border clash, again, that occurred in June 1937. Some of you, that may be, well, some of us may place that on timeline and realize that it's actually only a few weeks before the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which ultimately landed Japan and China in 8 years of grinding warfare. And that also receives coverage in this book because it is a study of Tojo, again, as Kwantung Army Chief of Staff, again, ignoring orders from the military authorities in Tokyo, and in fact, launching operations to the west of Manchuria across Inner Mongolia. And in the process, he escalated the fighting and I'm struggling to draw up the word, that whatever the antonym for localized is, he delocalized the conflict, widened the sphere of hostilities in direct defiance of orders coming from Tokyo, and in the process torpedoed his own government's attempt at de-escalating, localizing, and ending that conflict. The book is also a study of politics within the Imperial Japanese Army, and it takes the story back to, in fact, well, to Tojo's youth, because he was born into a military family. His father was a general, or a lieutenant general, in the Japanese Army. In fact, one of its leading lights as a staff officer in the early generation army. And yet he was forced, his father, was forced into early retirement in the early aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War, not for what we might consider, say, military reasons, but instead because of the Army's so-called Hanbatsu personnel practices, which effectively he had squared off against the ways in which officers from the former feudal domain of Choshu received kind of privileged positions within the Japanese army. So Tojo the Elder had squared off against those personnel practices and found himself offside with the top brass and was cashiered early in his career. This was that's not, of course, Tojo himself, and yet he maintained a burning hatred for Choshu and for officers hailing from that former feudal domain, all the way through to the very end of his military career. So that to offer a very, very quick example, in July 1944, when his time as Prime Minister, Army Chief of Staff, when basically his time atop the Japanese decision-making process came to its end, the Emperor effectively the Emperor approached him and offered 3 names as men who may succeed him as Prime Minister. One of those men was, they were all generals in the Japanese army. One was Teruichi, now I'm forgetting his name. Anyways, this man was in fact the son of the officer who had signed off on the orders which had cashiered Tojo's father. So this Tojo was a red line, and he refused point blank to even allow for the possibility that Teruichi could possibly succeed him as prime minister. It's a simple example, and perhaps not terribly enlightening. There are many other occasions through the say the 1920s and 1930s where Tojo squared off very, very directly against Choshu officers. But I feel like that's a nice bookend insofar as it comes at the very end of his career. And it's certainly herein, I think, lies the beginnings of Tojo as an intensely political figure. He himself, as I think I hopefully spell out in the book, he himself, I think, would have rejected the idea that he was a political general. He would have, I suspect, he would have seen it as almost insulting to be called a political general. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't a political general. The Japanese army was an intensely political force, and that the treatment afforded his father in the very, very early days of his own military career was in a way, it's the starting point of his own politicization, shall we say. That continues into the 1930s when the Japanese army descended into bruising and ultimately murderous factionalism. And I can't help myself. I'll run a very, very quick vignette by everybody, which we were in fact discussing before the formalities began. There's a wonderful story which traces back to August 1935, when the leader of the faction to which Tojo belonged. Tojo was effectively the number 2 within this faction. The leader of the faction was cut down by a sword-wielding junior officer from another faction. Tojo was out of Tokyo at this point. He'd been sent, well, let's leave it at that. He was out of Tokyo at this point and was in fact warned by factional allies to remain away from Tokyo, that he was next on the assassin's hit list. He nonetheless was first thing on the train back to Tokyo, visited the surviving family of his deceased friend and mentor. They gifted him the bloodstained uniform that he'd been wearing when he was cut down, and Tojo then proceeded back to his hotel room, undressed himself, dressed in this bloodstained uniform, and vowed revenge and or fidelity to the cause for which his great friend Nagata had fallen. He's an intensely formidable character. This is again, to go back to this idea of him as a politicized general, this is very, very, very fierce politics that's playing out within the Japanese army. And again, although I suspect practically all officers would have rejected the idea that they were playing politics here, this was politics at its fiercest, playing out within the Japanese army, and Tojo was one of the key players in this. And of course, all this is to say that his experiences through the early 1930s, it might be viewed as a political education, so that when he does become army minister, he's not a greenhorn. He doesn't step into a cabinet position without any grasp of how to play politics, as it were. And I'll leave that thought there because, well, in a way, maybe that folds in neatly enough with the next point which I wanted to raise. And I do think the book is a study of Tojo's relationship with the emperor, and indeed, not just Tojo, not just the personal relationship, but certainly through Tojo, how the emperor related to the Japanese army. In fact, if I think back to those early hesitations that I harbored when setting off on this project, this was in fact one of the key points that really started to pique my interest in Tojo and made me realize that actually this book can do something really quite different and quite interesting. It can offer a new look at this integral relationship between the 2 most powerful institutions in the Japanese state, namely the emperor and the army. And without going into any great detail, I'll simply perhaps note, and maybe we can address this in more detail in the question and answer period, but I do hope that readers might see a portrait of the emperor in this book, which departs significantly from portraits in the existing literature. The book is also a study of the Army-Navy relationship and Tojo's attempts at bridging the yawning chasm which existed between the two services. So I've already addressed, or at least already raised this idea that the Japan's armed services saw eye to eye on practically nothing. Tojo's efforts, certainly by the time, it's interesting because his training and his early career meant, and this operates at both ends of the spectrum, whether one was in the army or whether one was in the navy, the chance at cooperating or collaborating closely with an officer from the other armed service was not terribly high. And so one of the very, very, very few instances where Tojo did in fact have reasonably sustained contact with naval officers came with the death of the Taisho emperor in the mid-1920s, and the armed services cobbled together a funeral committee. And in this committee, both Army and Navy officers cooperated and collaborated. And that was one of the very, very, very few instances where he really, again, when we say sustained contact, we're talking across a period of weeks, but compared to his other contact he otherwise maintained with naval officers, this was quite sustained contact. And it speaks to this point that the two armed services never really saw eye to eye. And sometimes they clashed directly, but more often than not, they simply talked straight past each other and didn't really understand each other in any way or form. And perhaps the simplest way of putting this, so I've spoken about the book being, in one sense, a study of Japanese continental aggression, focusing, for example, in Manchuria, later in China, and then actually ultimately also in Southeast Asia as well, of course. Certainly Korea, Manchuria, China, Soviet Union, these were the traditional preserve of the Japanese military officer, for all the obvious reasons that an army, if it's going to fight, is going to fight on the continent. By the same token, a Navy officer had zero interest in any of that because ships don't move across the Siberian steppes. A Navy officer looked in precisely the opposite direction and looked out across the Pacific. And so that's a very, very simple illustration of this point that, again, in some, certainly on occasion, the two services clashed quite heatedly and quite directly with each other, but more often than not, they simply spoke past each other and really didn't understand each other terribly well. And so Tojo, I think, hopefully the book seeks to illustrate the ways in which he sought to overcome this yawning chasm between the two services. And in some cases, those efforts were ham-fisted. So a simple example being in the immediate aftermath of Tojo's, in the immediate aftermath of the emperor's orders to Tojo to form his own cabinet, in other words, to become prime minister, the Navy at that point named Toyoda Soemu as its preferred ministerial candidate in Tojo's cabinet. Toyoda had a reputation as being argumentative and extremely, in a Navy that is already anti-army, he had a reputation for being extremely anti-army, and Tojo pushed back. So when the Navy approached him and said, right, we plan to put Toyoda in your cabinet, Tojo pushed back really hard on this and said, well, if he's your pick as Navy minister, then I'm resigning before this cabinet is abortive and it's over. And this forced the Navy into long and serious discussions, which revolved around the question of, okay, do we bow before Tojo right here, right now, and offer him someone who's less argumentative. And in the process, if we do that, are we setting ourselves a really bad precedent where the Navy will in fact be constantly bending before Tojo and the army? Or do we put up stout resistance and do we say, no, we stick behind our man and you must accept Toyoda as Navy minister? Ultimately, the Navy went in the first direction. In other words, they retracted their initial choice of Toyoda and they gave, that might not be quite the right word, they gave Tojo instead Shimada Shigetaro, who was a yes man. So Tojo basically got what he wanted there. So there I would suggest is in many ways, quite a ham-fisted approach at building consensus between the armed services. But it's not always the case. So that, for example, once war did begin, Tojo repeatedly, how shall I put this? The two armed services were almost constantly in the fiercest competition, for example, for over steel allocations. The Navy's argument was quite simple. If we don't have steel, we can't build more ships. We will therefore lose the war. The Army's response was kind of obvious. Well, if we don't have steel, we can't build guns. Do you want us to fight with bamboo? Is that what? Which is literally one of the arguments that soldiers were throwing back at the Navy officers. These discussions became heated. At one point, at least, descended into fisticuffs. Tojo, more often than not, actually granted the Navy its wish and forced the Army to take a much lesser steel allocation than it thought necessary. So, yes, on occasion, he could be entirely ham-fisted in his approach at building consensus between the Army and Navy. At times, though, he showed a willingness, at least, to listen to the admirals and to effectively force the army to back down. And I could probably talk all day on that basic topic of the relationship between the two armed services, but rather than go down that particular rabbit hole, I'll maybe continue on with this idea or pursuing what this book hopefully sets out. And I do think the book hopefully is a study of the very, very complex relationship between the Japanese government and the Supreme Command. The two were, or let me try again, the Constitution allowed for the mutual independence of the cabinet and in wartime it was known as Imperial General Headquarters. And Tojo was proved remarkably adept at navigating the very real difficulties that this presented. And in fact, again, before the formalities began, we were discussing, and maybe this is a good point to raise right now. I'll offer a very quick example from Tojo's time in the immediate lead up to his appointment as Prime Minister. So we're now talking, shall we say, the period September, October, early October 1941. At this point, both the cabinet and the Supreme Command had met in the presence of the Emperor in a so-called Imperial Conference and had decided to impose a deadline for war against the United States. Prime Minister Konoye, in the aftermath of that decision, started backpedaling furiously. He belatedly realized that what was more than likely going to be the disastrous outcome of this decision and sought by any means possible to somehow unpick this deadline for war against the United States. And what we have here is this really interesting situation where Konoye is arguing, he's holding himself up as a peacemonger, and Tojo, who is his primary opponent in these debates, as a hawk, a war hawk, who is leading Japan to destruction. Tojo's argument is very, very different. His argument is that Konoye what he's doing is visiting chaos upon the Japanese decision-making process. And his arguments rested on a couple of key assumptions. So in the first instance, in Tojo's view, decisions reached at an imperial conference were effectively sacrosanct, and a prime minister on a whim could not simply undo a decision reached at an imperial conference. But his arguments went beyond that, because an imperial conference didn't just meet out of nowhere. These imperial conferences met after weeks, months of intensive debate between and among, for example, the cabinet and the supreme command. And those debates in the lead up to the imperial conference had in fact yielded a consensus on this very idea of a deadline for war against the United States. So Tojo, in effect, where Konoye is arguing that he's a peacemonger and that Tojo is just a war hawk and he's trying to lead Japan into war in the Pacific, Tojo is taking a very, very, very different position. He's arguing that no. Actually, what I'm arguing for is due policymaking process. That's all I ask. And beyond that, he's also pointing out, noting a point that I've already made, this idea of the mutual independence of the cabinet and the supreme command. Tojo made its unimpeachable point that even if he were to accept Konoye's arguments, and even if the cabinet then overturned the deadline for war, there was nothing compelling the supreme command to accept this. And so this would then it would visit even greater chaos on the Japanese decision-making process. So Tojo ultimately, by holding firm to these arguments, ultimately, you could argue that he's responsible ultimately for the downfall of the Konoye cabinet. But equally, you could argue that Konoye is responsible for the downfall of the Konoye cabinet, because he's departing from due policymaking process. He's trying to create policy on a wing and a prayer almost. And Tojo's holding him to account for decisions in which he himself had participated, which I think is perhaps an interesting counterpoint, and it's an interesting counterpoint to this idea of Tojo as a nothing more than just a war hawk who is pushing Japan into war. That's certainly true, but there's more to the story than that and that alone. I think what we also see here is a wonderful example of this idea of Tojo as a real political player. He did not simply acquiesce effectively in the narrative that Konoye was trying to create in September, October 41. He held firm behind his own narrative, which actually logically held a lot more water than anything that Konoye could state. And for that very reason, I would suggest the fact that his arguments were at the policymaking level unimpeachable, this in fact informs the emperor's subsequent decision to appoint or to order Tojo to form his own cabinet. In other words, it informs the emperor's decision to appoint Tojo as prime minister. He sees him as a steady hand, as it were. And this brings us to the next point. The book is hopefully a study of Japan's road to Pearl Harbor. Hopefully, it does not fall into what I think is a reasonably common trap of these road to war studies, because I do think when we look back at the trap being that looking back with hindsight, that road seems almost perfectly straight from Manchuria to the war in China to Pearl Harbor. It seems like this perfectly straight path that Japan treads on its way ultimately to Pearl Harbor and then ultimately to defeat in World War II. Hopefully this book offers a more nuanced look at this path to war and suggests, hopefully readers will walk away with the idea that this path was by no means predetermined, and let me see. To offer a couple of quick examples, I've tried as best I'm able to understand and to outline Tojo's reaction to a Japanese-US peace proposal emanating from Washington in April 1941. I think I'll leave that one there because I could probably talk that one for an hour or more if I get started. So I'll tether myself rather than go completely crazy on that thought. But simply maybe suffice it for now to note that Tojo seriously entertained that peace proposal in April 1941 and treated it very, very seriously, along with various other of his ministerial colleagues. I'll also note that I do think this book hopefully offers insights into how Tojo rode enthusiasm, but not only rode it, but also contained it and bottled up enthusiasm within the Japanese army for an assault on the Soviet Union. And here I'm talking, of course, in the context of Barbarossa. So the Nazis' attack on the Soviets in late June 1941, that presented to practically all Japanese army officers a golden opportunity to hit the Soviets from the Far Eastern end. Tojo rode that enthusiasm for all it was worth, but ultimately managed to contain that and bottle it up. And I think that in its own way had really, really interesting impacts on this rather winding path, Japan's winding path to war in the Pacific. The book is also a study of Tojo's search for what we might call a grand strategy. And I think it's really interesting that this search for a grand strategy, actually, it really only becomes apparent after Japan is at war in the Pacific. In other words, a lot of what's happening through the 1930s and indeed into 1941, it is almost naked opportunism without terribly much thought given to this idea of some kind of grand strategy. So there is, he engages repeatedly in attempts at defining grand strategy, but only after Japan is in fact at war. And maybe this is another one for the question and answer period. I would suggest that that's getting things the wrong way around. I think the grand strategy needs to be determined well before a nation marches to war. And that would, I think, perhaps guard against, certainly if it's done reasonably well, it would guard against what happens to Tojo during the war, whereby he's, if I put it colloquially, I won't do that. His grand strategy changes almost at the drop of a hat. It changes repeatedly through the course of the war in response to, of course, ultimately what was an American counterattack that was far faster and vastly more powerful than anything he had anticipated. The book is also a study of how the Navy in 1944, across a period of months, used practically all of its own institutional weight, and by July convinced the Emperor to withdraw his support for Tojo. And this meant ultimately that Tojo, this is his toppling from power. So it's the end of his time as Prime Minister, as Army Minister, as he took on a couple of other ministerial positions, which I should just note parenthetically, part of me did wonder when ScoMo was secretly taking on all those ministerial positions. I did see some interesting parallels there to back to Tojo during the war. And maybe this is a conversation that Andrew and I can take up maybe with everybody. We can take it elsewhere as well. But Simon's already noted that Andrew's working on Kishi, who also played his own role ultimately in Tojo's downfall. And I certainly haven't done Kishi any justice here today, and doubtless I probably haven't done injustice in here either, Andrew. So that will be of interest to take up his role in discussion. A couple of quick final thoughts. The book is equally a study of Japan's surrender, and this came roughly 12 months after Tojo was toppled from power. It provides this really interesting moment because Tojo, at this moment, say in around August 9 or thereabouts, so in the week or so leading up to Japan's surrender, he re-rose to a position of prominence, not formal prominence, but he rose to a position of prominence precisely because he squared off against the emperor's so-called sacred decision to end the war. And Tojo led the calls from within the army for a decisive home island battle. And that, well, it put him in almost, well, he tried very hard not to make it, not to put himself in direct opposition to his emperor, but ultimately he realized that's exactly what he was doing and he pulled back. And that it diffused, the situation diffused without anything too serious taking place. Nonetheless, there was, he was not the only Japanese soldier opposed to surrender, and there were fears floating around, certainly around Tokyo, that he may in fact lead the way in some kind of push against what he called cabinet policy. And then maybe last 2 points. The book is equally and hopefully, to some extent at least, a study of Tojo's performance at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, where he, in the words of one of the prosecutors, where he hanged the chief prosecutor. Of course, ultimately, Tojo himself hanged as a war criminal. And then the final point I'll note is that maybe it's not necessarily a study of, but it at least touches on Tojo's enduring villainy in post-war Japan. In this regard, I'm fond of quoting historian Furukawa Takahasa, who states that reasonably recently, in the last 10 years or so, wrote that Tojo's name remains, for most Japanese today, a byword for evil. And on that happy note, I think I will end and hand the floor back to Simon.